The Transmitter.
Tempest first considered the possibility that she was being discriminated against while reading an email exchange between her, Beth Mallow, and Dane Chekovich, who was chair of the neurology department at Vanderbilt University Medical Center. The emails were about whether Tempest could finish out her research as an adjunct after her position officially ended. And Tempest got the sense that Chekovich had no idea, she said, that her position was ending. In fact, she thought that Chekovich was under the impression that she was leaving voluntarily. And that felt like deception to her. So Tempest reached out to the Vanderbilt Faculty Senate and learned about the official processes for closing positions. And she filed her discrimination suit near the end of July 2022. The filing became charge number 494-2022-02571, Dr. T.A. McDonald v. Vanderbilt University Medical Center. In Tempest's Equal Employment Opportunity Commission case, she claimed that after she announced her plans to publish her data on the NIH funding, retaliatory actions of Dr. Mallow, Dr. Kripalani, and Dr. Chekovich began, she said. A small reminder here that Dr. Kripalani is Sunil Kripalani, professor of medicine at Vanderbilt University. The actions in the charge included, and here I'm quoting, constructive termination of Dr. McDonald, including via instructing her not to write grants, a primary job duty, direct termination of Dr. McDonald, informing her that her position would not be renewed in contravention of the previous written agreements between the parties, and redacting Dr. McDonald's reports to the NIH, all because of discomfort and irreconcilable differences with Dr. McDonald's investigation and report of discrimination in the NIH, end quote. The university responded in the case, writing that Tempest's position was scheduled to end naturally on October 31st, 2022, and that there was no support to show that VUMC discouraged Tempest from writing grants. And it noted that Beth Mallow requested on Tempest's behalf that she be approved for an adjunct position after the expiration of her contract. Also, in order for retaliation to be relevant, Vanderbilt said, Tempest would need to show that she participated in a protected activity, and for such participation, she suffered an adverse employment action. That was not the case, the university said. Simply because Tempest reached a conclusion that her mentor and other professors did not agree with her beliefs, that did not rise to protected activity, the university said. The EEOC, as it's called, in the end released the case back to Tempest and her lawyer in March 2023.
They released it to us to sue. They weren't going to pursue it.
What does that mean, released?
What it means is that you say that, we would like to have the permission from the EEOC to pursue this in court without waiting for the EEOC to give a decision. The EEOC had indicated to my lawyer that they did not want to weigh in on it.
Uh-huh. Meaning, we're not going to be able to say anything on this. If you want to go to court over this, you certainly can. We'll release it to you.
Right. There is sort of an implication that the possibility is that then that if you don't take that release, that then they'll basically say, we found nothing.
Tempest had lawyers who might try the case, and she talked it over with them. They weren't confident in their ability to fit the case under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, Tempest said, which prohibits employment discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. So Tempest sat back and weighed her position. Her paper had just been published, and she hoped to give talks on it and spread the word that way. She decided she could lay this down, she said, and so she finished her adjunct position in May 2023. And that was the end of her time at Vanderbilt. My name is Brady Huggett. This is When Autistic Kids Grow Up. Chapter 4. How did things unfold? As I mentioned, I went to Beth Mallow and asked if she'd like to participate in this podcast. She had worked with Tempest for years, and it seemed the two had been close. When Terry got his cancer diagnosis, for instance, Beth sent Tempest a sympathy card and a care package. The card reminded Tempest that she was loved, and that we are all thinking of you and your family. So I had a feeling that she might be willing to speak with me. And she was, at least initially. She agreed to hear more about what I was working on, and I set up a call. She was kind, considerate, and we had a warm conversation, at least in my opinion. But given all that had transpired, with the discrimination charge that Tempest had filed against the school, Beth wanted to see questions in advance before she'd consider going on the record. I emailed her 8 lines of inquiry, mostly asking for her recollection so I could compare them against what Tempest had told me. A few days later, I received an email from Vanderbilt University Medical Center's Chief Communications Officer containing a single sentence. It is VUMC's policy not to comment on personnel matters. Beth did not respond to further emails, so that is that. The Mind the NIH Funding Gap paper published in January 2023. As a reminder, the paper raked through the history of grants for autism research at the NIH and found, by their count, that in the past 4 decades, the NIH has not funded research for autistic adults that supports treatment, services, or programs for any of the 30 physical health disparity conditions as identified by the researcher Lisa A. Krohn. The study had limitations, the authors knew. They wrote in their paper that they were not able to access full details for all grants, which might have left some grants out of their searches. And they acknowledged that the reporter tool includes only successful grants, which meant the authors did not know the number and nature of proposed grants that are rejected. Still, Tempest felt the searches had turned up something. They submitted the paper to one journal, the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders. The peer review process was a breeze, Tempest told me. The reviewers asked only that she double-space the body of the article and the references. The final paper included definitions of institutional discrimination and structural discrimination, and the word eugenics appeared 9 times in the body of the text. This was a conscious decision. Here's co-author Audrey Scudder again. We heard from her first in Chapter 3.
There were several aspects of this paper that we discussed in terms of how people would react to it because of the language we were using. One of the terms was discrimination, but we made sure to define what discrimination means and talk about why we think this is happening. In the paper, we propose a couple different pathways that may explain why this research isn't getting funded. And I think each of those pathways demonstrates that this is not some evil person saying, no, this population can't have health care. It's just stuff that gets missed and stuff that doesn't get considered. The other language choice that we discussed as we were writing this paper was the use of the word eugenics. People get very, very defensive and very upset about the word eugenics. And I understand why, because we associate it with some of the most horrible things that have, happened ever.
Yeah.
But it is also a scientific practice that was very popular in the US for a decent amount of time and was largely targeted at groups with disabilities, at disabled people. And so it is something we have to keep in mind when we talk about what research is getting funded, what types of treatments are we using. We do have to, consider, is the attitude potentially that it is better to get rid of these people than to help them? And so it's, again, we're not saying that someone's trying to, do some big evil plot. It's just, we got to call it what it is. If there is any sort of evidence that that is what's happening, we have to make people uncomfortable a little bit, and so that we can address that there is an issue going on.
After publication, the response in the broader neuroscience community was mostly muted. The Vanderbilt University Medical Center put out a release about the publication, and that was reposted by a few aggregator sites. There was some activity on the social media site X. Tempest said she heard from some people who said they had experienced something similar in their own attempts to win grants. And she also heard from people in her circle who disagreed with the term discrimination, even if they agreed that there were roadblocks to getting certain kinds of funding at the NIH. According to Springer Nature, the publisher of the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders, the article had been accessed about 1,180 times since January 2023. It had 9 citations, which is about average for an article in JADD. I brought the paper to a few prominent researchers in the autism space for comment. One, who didn't want to be seen as attacking another researcher, told me that the use of language was the first thing they noticed in the paper, rather than the findings. Another called the paper a polemic and said it appeared to be fueled by anger and ego. I wanted insight from someone who has analyzed NIH funding, so I spoke with Ferric Fong, professor of laboratory medicine and pathology and director of Harborview Medical Center Clinical Microbiology Laboratory at the University of Washington School of Medicine. He has critically analyzed and published papers on the grant review process at the NIH. He has also written on the formation of scientific fields, noting that they allow researchers to collectively define the next important problems to pursue, but also that they can restrict access by outsiders and sustain dogmas that hinder process. So he seemed like a good source. And like others I spoke with, Fong noted that the tone of the NIH funding gap paper was a bit off-putting, and said that the broad strokes used to paint most autism research as eugenics-related could seem pejorative to its scientists. And the paper wasn't able to make a compelling case, he said, for systemic discrimination at the NIH because the dataset lacked details on the number and types of autism applications the NIH received. But, he said, the author still had a legitimate point. The NIH, he said, divides health science research into discrete categories, and if your work doesn't fall neatly into one of those categories, it can be difficult to find advocates and obtain support. And the dataset accumulated by Tempest and Audrey, he said, was at least able to show that their chosen research topic is relatively neglected. The NIH, for its part, had little to say about the funding gap paper. When presented with Tempest and Audrey's paper and asked about the results, the NIH responded that it does not expressly budget by category to the level that would be required to investigate grants targeting autistic adults. Therefore, it said, it could not verify their analysis. But there are people beyond Ferric Fong who felt Tempest and Audrey's paper, regardless of the validity of their analysis, was pointing in the direction of something true. Fred Volkmar is the Emeritus Irving B. Harris Professor of Child Psychiatry, Pediatrics, and Psychology at the Yale University Child Study Center, School of Medicine. He has an undergraduate degree in psychology and received from Stanford University a master's degree in psychology and a medical degree. He has published widely on autism, more than 300 articles, reviews, and case reports in academic journals, and he's written or edited more than 30 books or monographs, including the book Autism in Adolescents and Adults. So Fred has been immersed in the autism research field for a long time, and he was editor at the Journal of Autism and Developmental Disorders when Tempest's NIH funding gap article came across his desk.
We were getting like 1,500 submissions a year. I mean, we were turning down things right and left, so not easy to get through the peer review. But it got through peer review, and it's making basically a point, which is, geez, look at how little federal funding there is out there.
This was an issue that Fred was already familiar with, given his long tenure in the field.
So the backstory, the short version of the long story is there's a horrible, horrible problem with a lack of work with adults with autism. I have been very interested in this for a long time. And the problem is we have done a great job of identifying kids early, providing effective interventions for many, but not all. Kids with autism, things are going much better in the sense that we're getting them through high school. We're getting them into college. I am also aware there is bupkis at the federal level on adults. It's not impossible to find some stuff, but it's hard.
That's bupkis, if you didn't quite hear what Fred said, meaning, essentially, nothing. Fred thought that Tempest and Audrey's paper was raising a salient argument. And anyway, Fred viewed himself as an editor at the journal, he said, not a censor. Part of an editor's job, he thought, is to facilitate conversations.
And so if this helps bring a little attention, that's great. I wish people were having more active discussions about it. It's a shame that we have not done as much in this country on autism research in adults.
The paper also found a receptive audience with the people at the Autism Intervention Research Network on Physical Health, also called AIRP. It is primarily funded through the Health Resources and Services Administration, which is part of HHS, the U.S. Department of Health and Human Services. For years, AIRP was based at Massachusetts General Hospital and focused mostly on the needs of autistic children. But in 2020, UCLA took over leading the network with a new focus on optimal health and well-being of autistic individuals across the lifespan. That includes adults. It collaborates with 15 research groups, mostly academic centers or universities. Tempest's NIH funding gap paper reached the inbox of Alice Coe, the principal investigator at AIRP. She's an MD and has a clinical practice for patients with neurodevelopmental conditions and has a PhD in educational psychology and an MBA in healthcare administration. She also has an autistic son. And part of what AIRP wanted to do when it moved to UCLA was to be neurodiversity focused in its approach, Alice told me. That was baked into the proposal, she said. And the paper also reached Emily Hotez at AIRP. We heard from her in Chapter 1. She is a project scientist and a developmental psychologist and assistant professor at UCLA.
And I think for me, what TA's paper really did was it provided a really solid, concrete example of one way in which structural discrimination can directly affect the health outcomes of a marginalized population. And I don't think the take-home message is that NIH is discriminatory, but I think that the take-home message is that it really speaks to broader issues of structural discrimination that are rampant, of course, in research, but also in education and policy and practice.
Alice, for her part, was struck by the level of persistence it would have taken for Tempest to complete the study and paper, and she saw the article as an authentic voice of someone with lived experience. She told me that Tempest's paper is not about calling out the NIH, and that it's not like some big wizard is behind the scenes plotting to discriminate. But, she said, discrimination can happen through a collection of individual biases that allow people to not even think about the needs of people with disabilities. Here she is.
I think the one research finding that is also borne out by our own clinical data here at UCLA is the decreased life expectancy for autistic individuals. The fact that it's now being documented in multiple settings that autistic adults without an intellectual disability still, have this level of disparity, a 16-year disparity in life expectancy, is huge, and is why this is a public health crisis. Why this needs to be a public health concern, because anytime you see that level of discrepancy in life expectancy, and this is due to a brain type. Now, of course, autism as a brain type is associated with many related conditions like anxiety, ADHD, other things that could contribute to that. But the brain wiring itself is not associated with decreased life expectancy.
AIRP invited Tempest for a virtual talk on her paper. There was a small kerfluffle among some of AIRP's funders about the title of the talk after Tempest accepted, Alice said, and that put the presentation on pause. But in the end, Tempest presented the work on June 27, 2023. She prepared 43 slides. A version of the word discrimination appeared on nearly 20 of them. She had a slide on whitewashing, the NIH's track record on funding, and a couple of slides on eugenics. She had a slide titled Marginalization in U.S. Research History. In other words, in classic Tempest style, she really went for it. The 16-year disparity in life expectancy between autistic people and the general population that Alice Coe mentioned comes from a 2016 paper published in the British Journal of Psychiatry. It's titled Premature Mortality and Autism Spectrum Disorder, and it showed for the first time that both, and I quote, low-functioning and high-functioning ASD people died earlier than people in the control group. The study linked Sweden's National Patient Register and the Cause of Death Register. It included 27,122 individuals diagnosed with autism between 1987 and 2009, and it compared it with some 2.67 million control individuals, matched by gender, age, and county of residence. The data showed that individuals in the control group died on average at about 70 years of age, In the overall group with autism, however, the average age of death was about 54 years. The disparity was larger in the low-functioning group, to quote from the paper, where the average age of death was about 40 years. In the high-functioning group, the average age was about 58 years. Autistic people often have co-occurring conditions, as Alice pointed out, and that can affect health. And this is the public health crisis that Alice mentioned. The Interagency Autism Coordinating Committee, also called IAC, is an advisory committee on autism issues for the Secretary of Health and Human Services, the person who oversees the NIH. Remember that this is where Tempest sent her converted email blast about discrimination at the NIH before she began writing the NIH Funding Gap paper itself. Anyway, IAC was created in 2000 by Congress, and its funding has been renewed several times since, most recently in the Autism Collaboration, Accountability, Research, Education, and Support Act, also known as the CARES Act, in 2024. IAC tracks funding for autism research, and in its 2019-2020 portfolio analysis, its most recent at the time of this recording, it listed the top private and public funders of autism research by amounts supplied. Overall, according to IAC, in 2020, nearly $420 million were put into autism research, the vast majority of that supplied by the NIH at $285 million. Searching the NIH reporter database for research projects in the autism subfield returns more than 5,900 projects over its entire history. But a search through those projects for the keyword adult brings up just 83 projects. The NIH says it cannot verify this analysis and does not break down its funding to that level. The Department of Defense put about $14 million into autism research in 2020, but according to the department's 2024 program book, for fiscal years 2018 through 2023, only 5% of the department's autism research program went toward addressing the needs of autistic people into adulthood. On the private side, it's not much different. The Simons Foundation has been the largest supplier of private money for autism research for many years. Through the Simons Foundation Autism Research Initiative, called SAFARI, it has provided or committed more than $570 million in external research through 816 projects between 2006 and 2024. But of those 816 programs, just 20 of them include human adults in the study. It should be noted that the Simons Foundation is also the parent organization of The Transmitter. Meanwhile, the prevalence of autism diagnoses in children has been growing. In 2000, the CDC estimated that about 1 in 150 children were diagnosed with autism. The prevalence has increased every time the CDC has released the data, and in 2025, it had reached 1 in 31. The CDC has also estimated, based on 2017 prevalence data, that there are about 5.4 million autistic adults in the United States. That works out to be about 2.2% of the total population. But with the recent prevalence estimate of 1 in 31 8-year-olds having autism, that puts the percentage of U.S. children who are autistic at about 3.2%. And if 3.2% of children are autistic in the United States, then it suggests that one day about 3.2% of adults will be autistic. Now, that is not perfect math. Not all children live into adulthood, and as Alice Coe pointed out, autistic people do not live as long as the average human. Still, if that 3.2% is applied to the 2024 population of U.S. adults, you get a figure that is more like 8.5 million autistic adults in the country, not 5.4 million. Perhaps the most vocal voice on the lack of funding for research into the lives of autistic adults is the Autistic Self-Advocacy Network, also called ASAN. Zoe Gross is the director of advocacy for ASAN. She is autistic. She told me that ASAN is currently focused on achieving more funding for research into quality of life issues for autistic people, instead of biomedical or genetic research. ASAN also wants more research that focuses on the health conditions that co-occur with autism. Here she is.
So we know very little about what autism looks like as we age. There's initial data that suggests, for example, that autistic people are more likely to develop to develop Parkinson's in old age. But we really need to know much more about that. That's just an example of one of the many places where we need more study, and where like more data could really be critical to autistic adults' futures planning and, ability to understand what our lives are going to look like. And there's just a lot that's unknown.
One of the ways ASAN was trying to achieve these research goals is through IAC. For more than a decade, ASAN had representation on IAC. That ended this year when the Department of Health and Human Services announced 21 new members, and none of them were linked to ASAN. Regardless, IAC released its first strategic plan in 2009, and among its many recommendations was one to include a focus on autistic adults. It has released 8 strategic plans in total. The most recent was for the 2021-2023 time period. That one also included a set of recommendations around the question, how can we address the needs of people on the autism spectrum throughout the lifespan? So IAC for some time has been raising the alarm for research into the lives of autistic adults. But so far, not much progress has happened, and money has continued to flow toward research into autistic children. That's in the next and final episode. When Autistic Kids Grow Up was written and produced by me, Brady Huggett. Editing by Ivan Aransky and Paige Miranda. Art commissioned by Rebecca Horn. Music and audio engineering by Sam Schumann. And thank you to Rachel Newer for reporting help with this episode. Go to the podcast page of thetransmitter.org to see photographs for this chapter and for a PDF transcript. Thank you.